Music theory in electronic music production. It's something of a special topic for me, really. And I will say first, get it right out there, I'm a bit biased on this topic. Before I go through my list that I've made of things to just sort of talk about here. Just keep in mind that my first degree in university is the mathematics of musical rhythm, which is essentially a mathematically based music theory. So, keeping that in mind, I tend to use more music theory and mathematics in my music than some, or mathematical music theory as well, of course. So just keeping that in mind here as we go through some of these things I might mention on the topic. So this is more about my own sort of perspective on it. So to be sure, many another musician might very well not make much, if any, use of music theory. I know I've heard stories of folks not doing it at all. And anyway, so I think I'm stepping into some of these topics here, so I guess I'll just go ahead and start going in through my list here. Well, first of all, I think, yes, it's absolutely helpful in making any kind of music, including electronic music. You can use it, you can lose it, as the case may require. So, studying music theory can only help, right? It can give you insights, help you think clearly about what you're doing, whether you're playing live or you're composing outside of time, in the box with synthesizers, whatever else it is. And of course, you want to use all your senses and your thoughts and your emotions. It's a way of becoming more involved with your whole self, with your music. So, you got your feelings, of course, and you've got your intuition, you have your ears, and, your voice, or whatever it is for you as you go into the process of making music. And then it's nice to also have your mind, because where do you go in life without it? And why would you go without it while making music? So, so there's that. And I've also written here, music that has some logical sense to it tends to sound nice. And that's to say, even if it's an unusual music theoretic structure, it doesn't have to be whole tone, it doesn't have to be, a diatonic, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. It doesn't have to be stuck in the major scale, or even a mode therein, Dorian, Lydian, whatever. It can be a different scale, for example, a whole tone scale. It's just whole steps, as perhaps first made famous by Debussy, or an octatonic scale, where it's, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, which was used quite a lot in some types of jazz, as well as in some classical music. A more contemporary variety, to be sure, but nonetheless, there's some sort of sense to it. And you don't have to go, using some scale that's already been devised. If on the example of scales, you devise your own scale and you produce a composition or production using that scale or scales based around that scale or what have you, there's bound to be some sense to it. And I feel like our minds lock on to that, even if subconsciously. And this is a belief, so take it as you will, grain of salt, whatever. But I think that our minds are kind of processing this musical information, again, with all of our senses, our hearing, of course, but We get our emotions going. When we listen to music, we have our minds going. And there's also that subconscious level. I believe that we're somewhat processing the aesthetics of the music in a less than conscious way. And I think that, personally, if there's some sense to it, whether it's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, it's keeping your music, giving your music some kind of structure, or if it's, what have you, whole tone scales, or what have you. Now, this goes, of course, outside of, just the tonal structures, and in fact, of course, can also be a part of your rhythm, or how you approach rhythm in a particular composition, or in general. You could use, of course, your, powers of 2, 1 over thereof, your usual sort of standard, rhythm type structures, but you can also use polymeter or polyrhythms. Right? You can use a polytempo, 2 different tempos going on same time, giving similar effects, depending on how you're using it. And so there's a sense to it, though. There's a certain logic to it, and it doesn't have to be a traditional form of what you might study for the vast majority of your first 2 years in a music theory course, in college. It can be something different. It can be something of your own sort of creation or invention or discovery, or however you want to think of it. As long as there's some sense to it, I feel like we get that on some level. As listeners, we get that, and we can appreciate it more, even if it turns out to be something, whether it's atonal or what have you, something that many might not listen to on a regular basis. There's some sense to, say, Schoenberg or Webern or whatever else, the atonal serial music that we can appreciate, even if most of the time we're going to hear it in a scary moment in a movie and not necessarily when we're sitting back to listen to some tunes. But when there's a sense to something, we get that on some level. And so this is my main argument, I would say, for music theory in music. Right. So before I start going into other topics here that I've already written down to be spoken of elsewhere, let's see. Even if you make up your own theory, like I said that. So even if you make up your own theory, and really, many composers develop their own theory. We're talking about classical music, Debussy with the whole tones, already mentioned. Schoenberg, with the serial approach to music. Look that up if you're interested. It's a very interesting theory there. 12-tone, approach, where you don't play any one pitch more than any other pitch, or Xenakis, for example, very into theory, stochastic music, using a sort of randomness, if you will, as a primary method of composition. So, when you are making music, who's to say you're not also making your own theory? It's been done a lot, and so why not do it too? And all the more, therefore, to be familiar with music theory that's already been done and is still being done, right, as you pursue your own theoretical structures. Okay, what else do I have here? See, music theory is sometimes only learned after studying existing music. Now, that's somewhat true, because, again, composers themselves might very well have developed their own theory for compositions, or, musicians in general, jazz musicians, whatever else, might very well have developed their own sense of how to approach the song writing process. And then that theory is not noticed until someone else actually bothers to look at that more analytically. And so we get music theoreticians, studying the music of the world, or what have you, and finding patterns and structures that might or might not have been shared by the composer or the music makers in general. Right, so this is an argument to say you don't need to use the music theory, let the music theoreticians, worry about that. And of course, you'll hear that as a response to this whole topic. It's a fair enough thing to say, but again, referring back to what I said before, you certainly wouldn't be the first music maker to include consciously, some amount of music theory. Even if you allow for spontaneous improvisation upon or within that structure or what have you, thereafter, you wouldn't be the first to use some music theory consciously at some level. So yeah, and then what else is there to say there? Physics of sound and music, which is of course what you might think of when you think of the mathematics of music. And true, that is most certainly an aspect of it, although my own personal first degree was actually more based around the compositional elements, such as rhythm, pitch structures, and such, as opposed to the, harmonics and so on, physics of sound type things. But that said, it's very good to be aware of those things, especially in electronic music, where we have such ultimate control over these aspects of sound. We're actually creating sounds. It's not a matter of just picking up a pre-made instrument and going to town on it, and then sketching out some cool idea you came up with. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very good thing to do too. I'll jam out on a guitar, and next thing you know, I'm stuck in a riff, and it has to be turned into a song. I get that too, but I'm just saying, in electronic music, though, you can literally design your own sounds, and so being familiar with the physics of sound helps with that. To know what a sine wave is compared to a triangle wave, to a saw wave, and a square wave, in terms of the harmonics, and the even harmonics, the odd harmonics, how that relates to whether it's a trumpet-like sound or the violin-type sound, can help, even if you just kind of use it as an intuition, a guide for your intuition, yeah. And so, yeah, there's that. You don't have to be programming, your music in some music programming language, like C sound or Clyde or whatever. That said, there's another reason you might want to be more familiar with the mathematics and theory of music if you're going to approach music making more algorithmically, if you will. But even without that, it's nice to have a developed intuition on what's going on with the sounds. So yeah, and there's that. And then, let's see, what else is there? I already said it can only help, can't hurt. And let's see, I already kind of mentioned that not everyone uses theory per se. I might say on that topic, some have musicians. Not most, but some have a sort of perfect pitch. I believe I've met one. I know I met one musician who had perfect pitch. So that was kind of neat. I could play something on the piano, and he would be able to identify the pitches I just played, and then he could go off on his own instrument without even having to look at what I'm doing or me telling him, just chord to that chord. So it's fun to jam with him. But not all musicians have that. And so certainly if you don't, it's very helpful to have music theory under your belt. And yeah, so whether you have perfect pitch or not, though, you're of course going to play something or make something musically by ear, and that can't be underestimated to its significance. Of course, if it sounds good, it is good. That's the rule of thumb with music. Whatever you're doing, how you're doing it, if it sounds good, it is good. I'm just making an argument that if you're using some amount of music theory, it's more likely to sound good. And again, that could be consciously or unconsciously. my point of view is that if it sounds good, there's probably some reason to it, some reason to the rhyme, if you will. Yeah. And so I've got a little bit of a list here. Okay, yeah. And hey, music theory is kind of a beautiful subject unto itself. Again, a bit biased. My mind works like this. Not everyone's does. I know almost all of the musicians who were with me in my music theory courses mostly didn't like it. Mostly they were performers, though, wanted to go into music education and such, and not mostly composers. The composers in the course, interestingly, tended to like it. I don't know, maybe that's just anecdotal, but I'm sure there are performers out there that do like some music theory. And there are composers, or music makers anyway, out there that don't like music theory. I'm sure of that. I've heard of both anyway. But, and I've met some musicians who purely play by ear and don't really care too much for any music theory. But again, can only help, can't hurt. But again, the subject itself of music theory, if or when you can get into it, it's kind of a neat thing to learn about. It's kind of cool, in and of itself. It's an interesting subject to study. So while you're making music, why not study it? Whether you use it or not, consciously or otherwise, why not? It's sort of a good way to learn how these structures are conceived. How did different composers use different techniques, different approaches, with a whole tone scale or polymeter or what have you? How did that end up getting done historically? What were the motivations? What was the context? And it just gives you a sense of, oh yeah, wow, so because there was the process there, it sounded good. And it was a different process than, say, 4-part harmony or whatever, which can also sound good, of course, classic. But, so that sort of thing. And so there's that. And, like I said, you get a sort of deeper understanding of the evolution of music over the centuries. So when you listen to Mozart, you know what you're listening to compared to that of Beethoven or whoever else, and you get a sense of that, a sort of a deeper appreciation for what they were doing when you're listening to it. So there's that. And I've got to say for sure that, if nothing else, music theory is an absolutely useful language when you're trying to speak about music with others, especially when you're collaborating with other musicians or performing with other musicians. It's nice to know what the notes are called, what the chords are called, what the keys are called, if you intend to do any of that. And I know when you're making electronic music, you can do that all on your own without ever communicating to another soul. And that's nice. It's kind of great that you can do that. It's one of the reasons I love it so much. I don't have to depend on anyone else to do what I would rather do, or, try to agree on what style or whatever we're doing, or spend hours just thinking of a band name instead of actually making music. Just a little cliche there, joke. But, yeah. But when you are speaking with other people, it is nice to have a language to discuss the music. It just can't not be helpful, So, yeah. And another cool thing about theory is really you can teach yourself. I mean, yeah, it's nice to take a course and have a teacher and some classmates. And, of course, I'd recommend doing that if you can. If you have the time or the money to invest in that. Absolutely nice to experience it that way. But that said, so many helpful videos are out online. You can learn from, videos just about anywhere. You can pick up a book or two, just read, whatever's your preference, really. And you can go as far or not as far as you wish. And you can learn it on a need basis only, need-be basis, you wanted to know more about harmony because you're focused on that at the moment, well, go ahead and watch a couple videos on harmony, and probably you'll find something inspiring there too, which I don't think I mentioned here, but gosh, I should have written this down. Yeah, I mean, music theory itself can be inspiring. It's like when you actually study it in college, usually you are also writing at least a little tune, little piece. It doesn't have to be, full symphony or anything. But you write a little piece of music using that new theory that you've learned. And you don't have to be in a class to do that, right? It's like, once you learn about the whole tone scale or whatever, if you're me, you might want to know what that sounds like, and one of the best ways to know what something sounds like or feels like to make music there is to actually do it, so to use it in a composition or production. And so learning new ideas is, again, only helpful, can only be helpful, can't hurt. Or you might think, I like the whole tone scale, but I want one half step here, something like that. At any rate, it can also inspire new music for those who might want to explore some music theory. And I did write down here, study music theory, most relevant to your tastes. Oh, good. I'm glad I wrote that down because, you might be more interested in some jazz harmonies or some blues riffs, or what have you, than, say, classical structures. You might want to study specific to electronic music type theories, and there are some videos out on there on that. It's not quite as commonly taught in university levels, but you can find people who've bothered to use their university experience or music theory backgrounds and actually, share their findings on the music theory that they found in techno or what have you. So that's also a neat thing to do. Again, it can only help, can't hurt. And so yeah, music theory in music making, especially with electronic music, it can only be helpful. I didn't write this down here, but especially if you're not playing any instruments and you're just using whatever your piano roll or whatever to compose the chords, the bass lines, whatever else, it helps to know what these things look like as you're exploring, as you're creating, So yeah, I would just say that. There's I'm sure more I could say, and I'll probably think of something else to say. Maybe I'll make another video on this topic. It is kind of a cool one for me anyway. Actually writing a couple of monographs, and one of them is actually a mathematical analysis, or rather modeling system for a sort of theory of musical rhythm. So again, I'm pretty biased when it comes to music theory and using it in music making, and so take my words for what they're worth to you, but just keep these things in mind as you're thinking about maybe learning some more music theory. Personally, I find it a very inspirational thing, and I've made more than one song based around some music theoretic structure, and in electronic music as well. So all right, well, that's about that, I guess, on that, for now. So yeah, happy music making to you. I don't know, I just said that. Is that a good way to end the video? I'll work on it.